Welcome back to the Chats with Yvonne podcast with me, your host, Yvonne. I talk about public speaking because I love it and I want to help you love it too. On this podcast, we dive into the art of public speaking. I share my experiences with it and occasionally bring guests on to share their own, to help us learn, unlearn, and relearn how to engage with the art in ways that help us show up authentically. I approach my segments from my perspectives as a Latina, first gen, pretty much everything, Mexican American, woman in tech, and an ambivert, an introvert at my core with extroverted tendencies. All of this while also challenging some of my own perspectives along the way. History is whitewashed AF. We know this, right? So is the art of public speaking. While I always say that foundational knowledge, that is, the psychology behind body language, best tips for writing a speech, suggestions for how to make your message stick, is so important. It isn't often enough that I can find research or tips on the art of public speaking from the perspectives of our cultura. That's why it's so important to me to uncover and talk more about these topics on this podcast, because they greatly impact how we show up on stages, in public settings, in the office, wherever. Public speaking is for you even if you don't represent the demographic of the people we often see on the big stages, even if our history was not documented or given the space it deserves in textbooks in classrooms. I always say that public speaking can seem harder for our communities in white-dominated spaces because we may feel that in its perceived form, public speaking asks us to be different than who we are on a regular basis. Oh, you move your hands when you speak? Porque en tu familia, that's how you captivate your nieces and nephews, tias, moms, aka your audience? Well, here those movements have to be controlled. Your audience doesn't want too much of that. Oh, you wear red lipstick, beautiful eyeshadow, or sparkly shirts? What if that's not professional? And I know the industry has changed a lot, but I think we'd be lying if we didn't admit that there's still a little residue feeling of needing to look, quote, professional, speak professionally, also in quotes, and, quote, act professional, as defined by Eurocentric standards. I feel it all of the time, and I still struggle sometimes to bring my full self to work or in certain spaces, right? It's like all of a sudden we want that in the workplace. But do you really? And most importantly, I've already been conditioned to not show up in certain ways for years. It's going to take years to completely get rid of the impacts of that. I work in tech, and sometimes I'm like, okay, now that, quote, diversity fits your agenda, you want it. But the foundations of a business are built on the opposite of what you say you want. That's how I think of the field of public speaking sometimes. So today's segment is all about the history of public speaking and where we are today. I walk through the written history of public speaking and where it started, but I also draw connections to the history of spoken words in our communities that haven't necessarily been officially documented. I'll preface this by saying that I can't possibly fit every single piece of history, every single thought that I have into this segment because, trust me, I have a lot. But I hope that it sparks questions that make you want to dig deeper in your understanding of the history of public speaking and why you experience it the way that you do. And shoot, if y'all want part 2 of this, I will gladly do it. Let's start off by defining public speaking. Public speaking is 1, the act or process of making speeches in public, and 2, the art of effective oral communication with an audience. One thing that I've always said is that our culturas remain so strong within us because of the stories that our elders tell us. The conversations, the early mornings and late nights over a cup of cafecito de olla. We have been public speaking forever. The art of public speaking is something we grow up with, and it helps us hold on to the beautiful parts of our families and cultures. While our abuelita's stories are not in textbooks or her methods of communication aren't often studied or praised in the art of public speaking, they live within us, and the power with which they were told is a direct connection to our own power as public speakers. Here's what I mean by that. I can vividly recall my grandma telling me this story over and over and over again, each time just a little bit different, Because what would a story from Mamaster be without a little drama? The story would always start with, that like, that lets you know que cuando tú vas, ellas ya vienen. Y'all know what I'm talking about. They've been there, done that. I would visit Mexico every summer, starting when I was 6 years old. My brother didn't start coming along with me until he was a little older, but late in the afternoon, my grandma and I had gotten back from bringing my Papa Toño his almuerzo. We'd go back to the house and chill with the door open, just people watching. Then she'd tell me stories about my mom and growing up, but also about her own life. To give you some perspective about what my grandma was like, some things I love about my grandma, for example, one day I wore a skirt. She told me it was too short. The next day I wore a longer skirt, down to my ankles. I'm talking, you can't see nothing but skirt. And she told me it was too long. And I just laughed because she was so herself, so open to telling you like it was, and I knew it to be just so simply her. She was very old school, you could say, but also a total badass. The story of the snake was one where she was recogiendo leña to make a fire, and she was walking, saw the snake, and where most people would run away, she says she practically looked it into its eyes, battled off with it, put her leña down, grabbed it with her bare hands, and just twisted it to death. Doesn't that sound crazy? Now, there are some details I don't remember because siempre le echaba más crema a los tacos, but the reason I always think about my grandma's storytelling is because she is who I want to embody as a public speaker. She captivated the hell out of me. She held my attention. She added details that made me feel I was right there with her. She would look out into the distance as she recalled her story. She used her hands to show me. I will always lead with that. I understand that my power as a public speaker comes from the examples of powerful storytellers that I've encountered in my life. From my teachers to my tías, my mom, my abuela, my abuelo, my tíos. We're surrounded by incredible storytellers that also have a lot to teach us about the art of public speaking. All we have to do is pay attention and embrace it. Embrace that there are many ways to tell the story, that we can, in fact, use our upbringing to inform how we show up in these oftentimes white-dominated spaces. It's about finding power in our culture's ways of storytelling and about embracing everything that makes us who we are so that we can start showing up as that and feel truly empowered by it. As I said in the beginning, we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. It starts with the documentation of, quote, the first time that public speaking was used. I tried to create a timeline of events and did some research here. If I miss any main buckets of information, call me out on it and let me know. Like I said in the beginning, I can always dive into a part 2. This stuff is essentially what you'll find on Google and in some of the textbooks. And I want us to keep this in mind as we walk through it because, again, our abuelita's methods aren't written here, but your experiences listening and storytelling are valid. I tried to find the very first time that public speaking was practiced, and I found an article that said that public speaking started in Egypt, but that the written origin of public speaking starts in ancient Greece to promote political participation. So I suppose the formal study of public speaking starts in ancient Greece and around 621 BC. Side note, BC stands for before Christ, meaning that many years before the birth of Christ. I just need to call it out because whenever I saw this reading in textbooks or whatever it was in college, I'd be like, what does that even mean? I couldn't wrap my head around it really. So I wanted to clarify. Anyway, around this time, public speaking was developed in a form of advocacy. When lawmakers needed to get things passed, they needed to convince people about voting, similar to what we see now. During this time, the study of rhetoric rises. Rhetoric is essentially public speaking, but the actual definition is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. Then, in 384 to 322 BC, the homie Aristotle, who I learned about in 6th grade, was the first philosopher to consider the dynamics of public speaking and persuasion together. Through this, we learn about ethos, pathos, and logos. These are persuasion tools. And all this stuff is really bringing me back to my middle school days. I was in theater and philosophy classes, so this is definitely bringing me way back. And side note, around the same time, Plato, another well-known philosopher, thought that rhetoric was about deceiving rather than finding the truth. So, what does ethos, pathos, logos mean? Ethos is persuasion based on the character of the speaker, their credibility and ethics. Here, you trust the speaker. You get credibility from your audience and persuade through your delivery and content. Pathos is persuasion through using emotions and passion. I used to always confuse ethos and pathos because I thought emotion, ethos, but no. Ethos is all about the character of the speaker, credibility, and your ethics. More so what you believe, right? Pathos is about your emotions and your passions. You engage the emotions of your audience. That's why it's so important to know who your audience is and what will resonate with them. We're emotional beings, and when we can connect emotionally to what someone is saying, we can be persuaded. And now logos, using logic and evidence. This is primarily what I think a lawyer would use. They do use some of the other persuasion techniques totally, but this seems to be primarily how they go about it. You persuade people by communicating your rational thinking and thoughtful decision making. Essentially, they're all really a way of gaining trust from your audience. And by the way, using these methods doesn't make you fake, just saying. I know sometimes it can feel like if you're using these initially, it can be deceiving, sort of like what Plato thought, but I do think there's a way to do all of this while keeping it real to who you are. I do think it's important to know that for Aristotle, there was a really clear distinction between rhetoric and actually speaking. So rhetoric is the process of developing a persuasive argument, and the speaking part was about the delivery. This is important because during this time, everyone is going back and forth with each other like, content is more important. No, delivery is. And I'll quote the article because it says, the rhetorical tradition emphasized using rhetoric to find and advance truth, while speaking emphasized these skills as a toolkit to be used however the speaker needed to use them. And the debate continues really, what matters more? That you have a great stage presence or that your message is persuasive, or both? What do you all think? Then in 106 to 93 BC, the Roman Republic emerged, and a Roman philosopher, Cicero, said that we needed to balance content and the way it's delivered. So it's not just about the content, it's not just about the delivery, it's actually about both. And it's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it. He said, say something with substance and also deliver it in a compelling way. No nada más hables por hablar is basically what he's saying. Then we have el señor Quintilian, and I'm so sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, Quintilian, in 35 to 95 AD, that's after death, after Jesus emerged and stuff. Had to bring that one up because I remember, again, same thing as BC, who introduces us to the 5 canons of rhetoric, which tells us that, you know what, stop arguing about which one is more important. They both are, equally. So, here are his canons, or what I would call elements of rhetoric, aka public speaking. The first one is invention, compiling the content of your speech, so essentially your outline. Disposition, making sure your content is in order so that it is as efficient as possible. Style, how you use your words. This is all about, what does my voice sound like when I'm up there? What are the certain words that I enunciate? What is my vocabulary like? All that kind of stuff. Then we have memorization, knowing the content like the back of your hand. Now, I always say don't memorize, but I do advocate for knowing your content like the back of your hand, and I think this comes almost naturally once you've practiced enough. And lastly is the delivery, how you present once you're on stage. What he introduces here is basically a method for organizing your thoughts and elements to make sure you touch on when you're public speaking. And again, I want to keep this in mind, right? The goal of the way that they're talking about public speaking here is for political gain, for political persuasion. So it's really important to keep that in mind as well. They're not necessarily accounting for storytelling or captivating people through your story, your personal story, right? They have a very clear goal, or they could have I'm assuming they have a very clear goal here, that the official documentation of public speaking starts when, hey, we got to get people on our side. Let's start persuading some people. Then from 400 to 1400 AD, the Roman Empire fell and Christianity was taking over. In Christianity, there was a distrust of the field of rhetoric. It became what they called a pagan art, which is something or someone that isn't converted or doesn't practice Christianity. So, like many things, because the narrative didn't fall in line with what the Christian religion said, it must be wrong. How many times have we heard that one? And so around this time, because it became a pagan art, something that didn't really matter, that wasn't converted, it was almost looked down upon to study rhetoric, to learn more about how we speak and how we persuade people. Now let's move to the 14th and 16th centuries. People started to be interested in what they called classical culture, and people were interested in the arts. And during this time, people thought, well, if we study the arts, we can learn more about the human experience. Though there were a ton of people that felt that our human experience could really only be understood through the sciences. Honestly, this makes me feel like this is why people are always like, oh my God, you're going to study the humanities? That's so easy. Like, no respect for the art. Shit. But it really does impact the way that people see the humanities majors, right? That's just a side note that I'm noticing now. It's like, we used to study it because we understood that it helped us gain political persuasion or gain votes, whatever it was. And then Christianity came along and they were like, no, you're not converted. That's not what we do. That's not what we teach. And we're like, okay, never mind. And now 14th, 16th century, we're coming back to it like, I want to learn a little bit more about it. Then 1600s to about through the 1800s, Western culture pretty much became what we see today. The idea that we have a democracy where everything is fair. And during this time, new views about public speaking also rose. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the movements that came from this time era. The Epistemological Tradition, which is all about how we know what we know. It's the study of the origin, nature, methods, and limits of human knowledge. We look at how language works and what role psychology plays in communication. Then, the Belles Lettres movement has everything to do with the aesthetics of writing. And I am so sorry if I said that incorrectly. Language was considered a form of determining your education levels. It mattered more how beautifully you said something than what you were actually saying. This one sort of pisses me off because this is the reason I always feel like I have to use bigger words than what I want to. If English, for example, is your second language and your expertise is determined by how beautifully you use words that are thought to indicate that you're smart, it creates a separation between you and what the norm is. It can make you feel like you have to say things a certain way to be taken seriously. And unfortunately, in a lot of spaces, that's the case because we've normalized this. Then there's the elocutionary movement, which focuses on the delivery. It emphasizes points in your speech where you can have large, planned gestures, loud and dramatic voice inflections, and exaggerated movements. This was all about finding the right formula for body language. But then it became so much of a formula that it was starting to come off as fake. So if every time you say the word you're moving your left hand up, it can come off as just being fake and too planned out. So in the Gilded Age, and side note, this is the Met Gala theme. So mid-1800s through the 1900s, there wasn't media coverage in the same way we see today. So instead, people would gather in large crowds to share their viewpoints. They didn't have mics even, so people, and let's be honest, mostly men, had to be really loud and expressive to get the massive crowds to hear them. And maybe that's why today we sometimes still think that you have to be the loudest in the room to get the opportunity. And quite frankly, that's still what's rewarded. Like, chill people, we have mics and speakers now. Also, not everyone got to be a public speaker, or really probably was interested in doing so. These were mostly politicians at the time. So if you were a public speaker, you were held in high regards. You were expected to have a control of language, to almost speak poetically. If you were a good debater, that was also admired. It was attached to your intellectual abilities. So damn, if someone wasn't really used to it, even now, going up on stage and not using freaking poetry to speak, then you might feel a little uncomfortable. Like, the reason you feel intimidated to speak in front of the classroom, to even ask a question in college, isn't because you lack knowledge. It's probably because everyone else uses big words or jargon to express themselves, and it can feel like you'll sound less smart if you don't use them. This is probably another podcast episode, but think about it. The back and forth we go through. What we see is people using big words on stage because that's an indicator of intelligence. But then there are also studies that say that if you can't repeat something to someone in simple terms, you don't actually understand it. So you're not intelligent? So we'll get back to this one in a future episode because I have lots of thoughts here. Now let's talk about where we are today. The way that we public speak and do a lot of everything else is influenced by radio, film, TV, and of course, our favorite social media. Our favorite, not so favorite social media. I learned that radio was used more for sort of fireside chats or more chill speeches in people's homes, sort of like podcasting, I'd say. Movies were all about the artificial and the drama, so everything was just bigger. TV, we were able to hear and see people, which is groundbreaking because the first TV didn't come out until 1927 and really didn't start more largely being in people's homes until around 1955, at least here in the United States, when half of homes in the US had one. This is groundbreaking because now you didn't necessarily have to go to the big crowds to go see someone speak. You could watch them on TV. And then we have the internet. The internet impacts public speaking because not only can we share and analyze it on our own time, but we can fact check it and we can debunk it. It gives us more access to be able to do this. So public speakers have to get really good at bringing their A game, right? You can no longer say, hey, this is what I'm going to say, and no one can really prove me wrong. No one else knows besides the people in this room what I'm talking about. Now the whole world knows. Whereas before, maybe we wanted presentations to be long and detailed, we actually are more looking for clear, distinct presentations where we don't necessarily need to listen to someone talk for an hour. With the rise of short-form content, we oftentimes want people to just get to the point. I'm of the belief that if you captivate your audience and you mix all the right ingredients, you can keep someone's attention for as long as you needed it to tell your story. I mean, my mama said had me hooked, and it also helped that I respected her immensely, so I would never cut her off. But I know we're all used to the TikToks and just the 2-3 minutes or less videos, but I truly think that when you are committed, when you respect the person, when you build a relationship with your audience, you're able to keep them captivated for a lot longer than that. And I promise you they'll want to. If you're like me, when I understand the history of public speaking in the context that I just walked through, it gives me a great perspective about why we are where we are with the industry. But I also am left wondering where the oral traditions of my family fit. The storytelling, the poetry, the folklore stories like the famous Llorona. And honestly, who can forget the jokes that sometimes hit a little too close to home? Like, our people get creative with it. We come to understand much about the world through the stories that our elders tell us. We don't need textbooks to learn about our traditions because they're passed down to us. We don't need to take a test on whether we know the difference and significance between tú y usted because that knowledge is passed down to us in the spoken word. O sea, through public speaking. So, we're not as, I'll say, foreign to the art of public speaking as we may think. When I suggest that people don't memorize their speeches, for example, it's because I know we have it in us to follow our own rhythm, to tell our stories so powerfully and authentically. There's just something so beautiful about letting the words effortlessly roll from the tongue and bring people in. Our way of moving our hands creates an intimacy that just isn't quite emphasized in the more methodical practicing of movement we know politicians practice, for example. This is different than what Aristotle, Plato, and all of the philosophers could even understand. How could they? They weren't necessarily exposed to it. I mean, I'm totally making assumptions here. You can call it storytelling, chisme, oral communication, whatever. Public speaking is our culture. It's an essential part of who we are, and it's important to me that I continue to point out exactly why we are already incredible public speakers and how we actually have so much power in the spaces we're a part of. Public speaking can be tough, loud, overly rigid, but it can also be beautiful, imperfect, culturally relevant, passionate, real, authentic. It can and is you. Storytelling, public speaking is a way of keeping our power. I want to read this quote excerpt from Storytelling in Mexican Homes, Connections Between Oral and Literacy Practices by Leslie Reese through PubMed Central. Quote, "The importance of intangible cultural heritage is not the cultural manifestation itself, but rather the wealth of knowledge and skills that is transmitted through it from one generation to the next. The social and economic value of this transmission of knowledge is relevant for minority groups and for mainstream social groups within a state, and is as important for developing states as for developed ones." We ain't the minority though. Anyway, seen from this perspective, the dichos, narratives, legends, stories, and consejos that make up the lived experiences of many Mexican and Mexican immigrant families represent a resource for communities and individuals. For children in particular, home activities that families construct and sustain have a profound impact on children's development through their participation in mediated social learning embedded in goal-directed interactions. End quote. We use storytelling to make each other laugh, cry. We use it to learn about our culture, and we use it to, in many ways, create how we exist in the world. Next time you have to give a presentation, or you're in a meeting room, or you're hosting an IG Live, whatever it is, and you think you have to speak a certain way, understand that yes, there's a method to the madness, as they'll put it, right? We learned about the history, written history, I'll call it, of public speaking, and the methods for persuasion. But in the midst of the madness, there is room to honor our own ways of storytelling, the ways that we've been telling stories for years, that our families have told stories to us. Those are all just as impactful. You're just as intelligent for using those. All the words that you can think of right now to validate that type of storytelling, the type that your tía tells you, that your mom tells you, that your grandma, in my case, my mama's ter, our abuelitas or abuelitos tell us. Anything that you can think of right now, that form of storytelling is valid. I'll end with this. I talked to my little sister about this podcast episode, and I was telling her that I essentially talked about how often the study and history of public speaking is very whitewashed, or in better terms, just not as culturally relevant to us, for example. Her immediate response was like, what about Malcolm X or like MLK? They're great public speakers. And yes, she is right in that I'm not saying there aren't powerful public speakers of color or that we don't show up unapologetically. I'm not saying that those don't exist, but even in these examples, they've had to show up in spaces against all odds, face opposition for being them and showing up as such. They were met with resistance, and that's unfair. That's what I mean when I say the industry can feel like it asks us to be something different than who we are, or that we have to constantly be in resistance or battling something in order to be able to show up as ourselves and unapologetically share our cultures without some kind of pushback. Now, I'm not saying that these public speakers and, like the greatest public speakers don't adopt public speaking techniques. That's not what I'm saying at all, because they are valid. The techniques that we have learned about are incredibly valid. I'm just advocating for us adding an additional layer to our understanding of the industry and how we speak and how we storytell. It's an important part of making us feel like we also belong up on stages and can be a part of the larger conversation without feeling like we need to use these big words or we need to control the way that I move my hands way too much because of this, whatever it is, right? And at the end of the day, yes, there is, as I mentioned, a method to the madness, things that are proven to work, but there is room to be yourself. I hope today's episode gets us to think about our forms of storytelling as powerful tools for public speaking. We have it in us already. So thank you so much for stopping by and spending some time with me. You're one step closer to loving the art of public speaking, and for that, I am incredibly happy. Next time, I'll be sharing all of the jobs I've had so far and talking more about how growing my public speaking skills has helped me find each and every one of my jobs and actually helped me elevate within them. We'll also have a guest speaker, so I'm very excited about that. Remember to speak your mind in the review section, wherever you listen to this podcast. I'd really appreciate it, and it helps more people connect with the art of public speaking. We'll chat later. This next clip that you're about to hear is actually a bonus to this segment, and this is where I sat down with my little sister and we chatted about public speaking. She talked to me about her experiences with it and even tapped into a little bit about how being in folklorico has actually helped with her confidence as a speaker when she gives presentations in the classroom. Enjoy. All right, so for the next segment of this podcast, I want to introduce you all to my little sister. We're just going to talk about public speaking in a very casual way. I literally just asked her maybe 10 minutes ago to sit down and just chat with me. So here is Karina. Tell us your name and a bit about yourself.
My name is Karina Zamora. My birthday is on July 10th. So I'm a Cancer, like Yvonne.
Woo-woo.
And I'm a junior.
Over the summer, you work as a teacher too sometimes?
Over the summer, I work as a teacher, but I work as a teacher for preschoolers.
What do you think about public speaking? When I say public speaking, what's the first word or thought that comes to mind?
The first thought that comes to mind for me is presentations, because now, well, all schools you have to present and stuff, so I guess now as a junior I have to present more stuff in like my different classes, except for math or science.
Would you say you're an introvert?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I don't talk to people very much. Or I don't go out of my way to make conversation, I guess.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, if I find someone like, oh, that seems like a really cool person, I should make friends with them. And I do, but not with, like, just anyone.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't talk with random people.
When did you first start doing presentations in school, for example? And how did you learn how to be a good presenter?
It was kind of, the first presentation that I ever remember was in 5th grade. You helped me with this project, actually. I don't know if you remember. I had to, like, do a presentation on rocks. Mm-hmm. And, like, I had to draw rocks and stuff.
Oh, yeah, I do remember.
It was, like, the poster board, and it was, like, last minute, the night before. Yeah. That was, like, my first memory, and I remember that I was super, like, really nervous. Like, going up there, I was so nervous, and it was strange because before I had all the information down. But I think what made me more nervous was while I was presenting, because we were in 5th grade, so there was this kid and was like, your rock looks like a block of cheese. In the middle of the presentation, I was like, what the hell? Like, okay. And then I had to keep presenting, and that made me more nervous because I did it, I worked on that. So that's my first memory, and it wasn't super great.
And how would you say you feel now about public speaking?
Now I'm pretty good. As long as I know the information, I've been pretty good, like, at both doing, like, giving them the information they need and making it entertaining, like cracking jokes.
That's like your style. Your style is jokes.
That's my style. And also another thing that has helped me with that is performing, like dance and stuff. That's helped me because...
And what kind do you do?
I dance folklorico, but right now we're doing, like, different. I've danced folklorico, and I've danced flamenco too.
Yeah, and I think Gary has really tapped into our culture in that way. I mean, not that you were disconnected from it before, but I think it's made her just more... Not outgoing. I wouldn't say outgoing is the word, but just more confident. Yeah, I think it's made you more confident. And part of what I talked about in this podcast episode is about the history of public speaking and how sometimes we may feel like we can't bring ourselves to it. Like we have to be super rigid, and you crack jokes, right? Like that's your thing. Yeah. Sometimes we feel like we have to be super professional, like what you were talking about. I have to cite all of these sources. And yes, you want to be credible, but there are certain situations where you probably benefit from bringing your culture into it, and bringing our culture to public speaking in particular, I think makes it even more powerful. And you connect with the art even more because you're not leaving one side of yourself out of the equation. You're bringing it all into it to talk about what you know in a very like confident way that comes from being empowered from your culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has. And here's another thing that I need to work on, kind of. A lot of the public speaking stuff that I've done has been with groups. So we've been working on it. People have like checked over my work. I've checked over other people's work to make sure it's okay. But I remember this year, actually, do you remember the poem that I wrote? I was working it with...
In the summer?
Yeah.
Yeah. About the banana bread?
No, not that one.
Oh.
That one was freshman
And the
year.
apricots?
That one was freshman. Oh my god, that was such an embarrassing thing. I still have it in my iMovie. It was such a fun thing to do because like I got to work and stuff, like make my own little movie, but it was kind of awkward too.
Yeah.
Because I had to do it in my little phone. But no, this year I did like a poetry thing that for AP English.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so weird because when I'm with a group and I am gathering information that is like 100% good and credible, I feel like it's different from presenting something that I made, like I did myself.
Yeah,
and
it is.
I wanted, like, for the poem, people had time to go up, and they could go up and get like 1 extra credit point, which is nothing basically. But and plus I already had an A in that class, so I didn't need it. But I still wanted to because I thought that my poem was awesome. So, but I didn't end up going up because I got shy, and I was like, what if people don't like it? Or what if it's like super unprofessional, and what if like it's not even a poem because not everything rhymes or doesn't have synthesis, stuff like that. So that's another thing. Original stuff is way harder to like present about, I think.
In some ways there's some parts of it that can seem more easy, right? Because you're like, well, there's no right or wrong when it comes to this because I created it. Like, it didn't come from, I didn't have to study something else, or I didn't have to quote someone else. But at the same time, it's also a very vulnerable position to be in and be like, well, I'm just going to share this because there is no structure to it. So what I talked about, maybe sometimes some structure is good. I always say it's good to understand the foundations of public speaking and where the written history exists. But it's also important to know that there's a lot of unwritten history. Like I talked about a story that Mama Sther used to always tell me, and how Mama Sther would use her hands and she would enunciate words, and that is public speaking too. It's not just going up on a stage. And it's similar to what you're talking about, having your own story or your own original work can be a lot more intimidating to bring to the table when there isn't this common ground among what is presented. Like, for example, I don't know, everyone's going to talk about this book because you're all reading it, versus if you come and say, hey, here's my poem, it's just a little bit more intimidating to be different.
I guess so. And it's also like, for specifically with the poem, other people were doing like different style of poems, I guess. Like if I were to go up and do a song or something like that, even then I would be kind of intimidated because I know that a song, like even beats and lyrics, they can all like have the same words as another song, and it's like, oh, I should probably make it different from somebody else's. I want to make it as original as possible. Or like, what if somebody catches me
plagiarizing?
Plagiarizing. No, I'm just kidding.
Taking their stuff.
No, like, I don't know. It's difficult, I guess.
Yeah.
But the dancing is kind of different because you don't use your words. You're using like your body.
Yeah.
Using your body, you're using your feet, the beat that you make with your feet. With flamenco, your hands. With bachata, your hips.
Yeah. I mean, and that in and of itself, one aspect of public speaking that a lot of people don't think about is body language. And so dancing may also help you in how you show up when you're on stage. Like in your classes, you have to stand up straight because you have that big ass skirt that you're flapping around, right? And you have to smile and all this stuff. Those are all things you can take when you're doing presentations too.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. All right, Gadi. Well, it was very nice talking to you. Any other words you'd like to say about the art of public speaking before we close this episode off?
Nope.
Oh, come on.
Nothing I can think of. Nothing I can think of at all.
So do you like public speaking? Let's end with that. Do you even like public speaking?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know.
That doesn't sound real convincing.
Well, I said like English class when I was presenting, it was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's something that I have to, I guess, source or talk too much about, then if it's a boring topic.
Yeah, you want to feel connected to it.
Yeah, because if it's a fun topic that I can like input my own kind of thoughts into.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
One more question. Do you get nervous about public speaking? Like when you're doing your presentations in class, do you get nervous about it?
I do get nervous, but in order to stop the nervousness, I have to think about like different things, distract my mind completely.
Mm-hmm.
But then that also makes me forget like what I'm going to say. Or I can be, I don't know what I've done. Like, what have I done? Before a presentation, I'll like hype myself up, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like be like, we've done this a million times. This is super easy. This is
almost like downplay it.
Yeah, this is a piece of cake. There's nothing to this. This is just a piece of cake. Like, don't worry about it, I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess yes, I do get nervous.
I mean, I think everyone gets nervous, but anyway, so thank you, Gotti, for being on this podcast episode so last minute. I appreciate our conversation, and I shall help you with your presentation tonight if you would like that help.
Okay. Sounds good.